All right. Thank you all for coming out tonight, braving the terrible humidity. Come out here to learn about this. I am actually very excited for this program tonight because this is something that I've spent about a year on now. I first started on this when I was working at Tippecanoe County Public Library. I was there until this last October. I now work at Wabash College. And as part of that, when I was writing bicentennial book articles, I came across The Informer. 3 bound volumes of TCPL, this kind of just obscure newspaper that I didn't know very much about. And in the process of writing about this newspaper, I learned a lot more about Jack Lillard. I also learned a lot more about Lafayette's Black community in the 60s and early 70s. And so I'm very excited to finally put this all together and present it for you. So tonight, we're going to divide this in a few parts. First off, we're going to give an introduction and talk about Lillard's early life when he was born and what Lafayette's Black community looked like at the time when he was growing up. Then we'll go into Lillard and his time in the 1960s, and then leading into The Informer, which was published 1969 to around 1972. There's not really a formal end date for that. And then finally, Lillard's life after The Informer was published. So Jack Lillard was born Bernard Othello Jack Lillard on July 22nd, 1922 in Lafayette. He was a lifelong resident of Lafayette, and he was a 4th generation Lafayette resident. So his family was here for a very long time by the time he was born. He graduated from Jeff High School in 1942. And when you look through the 1942 Nautilus, the Jeff yearbook, you notice that there were 239 students in the senior class that year, and Lillard was one of only 5 Blacks in the class. So very, very small number. And so then kind of going off of that, what did Lafayette's Black community look like at the time when Lillard was growing up? So historically, Lafayette's Black community has been very small. At the first census in 1850, there was only 132, and it never exceeded 200 until the end of the 19th century. But with that said, it was still a very vibrant community despite being so small. Most residents held non-skilled labor jobs, so like cooks, gardeners, barbers, boat makers, things like that. And again, it was very strong and vibrant despite being very small and also in the face of segregation. The segregation in Lafayette took on many forms. Maybe it wasn't blatantly obvious like we see some in other places, but it was still there nonetheless. In those cases, Blacks were pushed to the margins, and in this instance, I've highlighted 3 different instances where Blacks were sort of pushed to those margins and like how they kind of worked around the barriers of segregation. So the first one is newspapers, Black news in Lafayette. So Lafayette has never had a Black newspaper until The Informer came along in the 1960s. That's because Black newspapers were generally published in cities with larger Black populations in Indiana, so Indianapolis, Evansville, and Gary primarily. Usually if there was a Black newspaper in a smaller city, it didn't last very long because Black newspapers relied more on subscription revenue rather than advertising revenue. So that's why they were based in those larger communities where they could draw upon that money. But with that said, there were dedicated societal columns to Black news, News of the Colored People and Our Colored People. These appeared in either the Lafayette Daily Journal or the Lafayette Daily Courier, just kind of depended on what time period you were looking at. And then once the Journal and the Courier merged in 1920, those columns continued into the 1950s in the Journal and Courier. These typically covered societal news like marriages, funerals, church news, things like that. Not a lot of political news. Occasionally you'd see it, but not a whole lot. In 1969, in an editorial in The Informer, Lillard wrote about the value of the Black press to the Black community, calling it an untrammeled voice of truth, freedom, and justice. Sort of this. It was a way to build heritage in the community was with the Black newspapers. It showed you could talk about different historical events, you could talk about political events. It was really just this kind of communal gathering space for a lot of Black news. Another form of segregation in Lafayette was education, most notably with Lincoln School. So Black education was segregated from 1869 to 1951. 1869 is when the first official Black school was established here in Lafayette. And Lincoln School is probably the most famous of that. It was in existence from 1923 to 1951 when segregation ended. Longtime principal was Sterling McElwain. He was there at Lincoln for about 40 years, I believe. So students went to Jeff after 8th grade because Lafayette did not have a black high school. Similar to black newspapers, black high schools were only in locations with large black populations. So again, Gary, Evansville, and Indianapolis. And in a 1993 Journal and Courier article on Lincoln School, Lillard was interviewed for his recollections on going to Lincoln. And he talked about how students really looked up to McElwain as sort of a father figure. He was just a very stern, but also a very, very good educator for them. And as Lillard recalled, McElwain told them, you will not go down to Jeff High School and embarrass me. So you will learn English and you will learn math and then go to Jeff. But besides being a source of education, Lincoln was also a linchpin of the black community. It was the center of a community within a community. It helped maintain that community around it. So this would have been over by St. E. Hospital. In addition to housing the school, the building also housed the Lincoln Community Center, which provided a social outlet for residents living in the neighborhood. And once the school closed in 1951, the neighborhood slowly broke up because of that, because residents now were no longer tied to just being in that one little part of town. They could move to be closer to better schools if they wanted to. And then after the school closed, the community center eventually moved out of the building as well in the 1960s. So it kind of just left the building vacant. And really that part of the community just didn't have that linchpin anymore. And the final one is black churches. So probably the most famous one that we think of here in Lafayette is Bethel AME over here by St. Boniface, which was organized in 1846. And it sponsored that first school for blacks. The school was behind the AME church building. And it was a center for cultural, education, and political activity. But in our story, AME doesn't figure as heavily into this because Lillard was a member of Second Baptist Church, which was at 16th and Hartford Streets. And so Second Baptist was formed in 1872 and it still exists, but it eventually moved out of the neighborhood in the 1980s due to expansion of St. E. So after high school, Lillard pops up occasionally in the Journal and Courier. He was an amateur boxer in 1940. He was in a flyweight championship that year. He was also secretary for the Lafayette Bulldogs, which was a local amateur basketball team. I've not been able to find a whole lot of information on this. I don't know if it was like a team composed just entirely of blacks or if it was integrated. I just have not been able to find a lot of information on that. And then in the 1950s, he owned Jack's Janitor Service. If you go through Journal and Couriers from 1958, you can see ads for Jack's Janitor Service in there. So now we get into the 1960s. In the 1960s, we see an increase in political issues, or increase in interest in political issues amongst blacks, because with the prevalence of television, news spread more widely. So now people were becoming more aware of issues that blacks were facing in their everyday lives. Because of that, they became more vocal about those issues that were facing them, most notably with Martin Luther King. But then there was also a rise in extremism as well with the Black Panthers. And then amongst that here locally, there was also the slow disintegration of the black neighborhood in Lafayette. So as the 60s go on, Lillard becomes more publicly involved. He became secretary for the Floyd Lodge in 1964. He was an office manager at a life insurance company. And then he was named an officer of the Human Relations Council in 1967. So the Human Relations Council is not related to the Human Relations Commission that we think of today. It was sort of like a precursor to it. It was formed in 1964 to ease racial barriers by investigating different issues related to housing, legislative education, and low enrollment of blacks at Purdue. And it was chaired by Ralph McFadden, who was the minister at the Church of the Brethren. So I'm not entirely sure like if the council morphed into the commission or what exactly, but I do know that Human Relations Commission, which we know now, was formed in April of 1968 after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. And it was formed in a similar way to improve the opportunities for blacks and minorities here in Lafayette. It was announced in a ceremony, it was announced in a joint statement by the mayors of Lafayette and West Lafayette at a reception or like a memorial service for Martin Luther King following his assassination. Unfortunately, though, it had a troubled start in Lafayette. Just a day after the Human Relations Commission was announced here in Lafayette, Mayor Donald Blue mayor of Lafayette, he stirred some controversy over remarks he made over the commission's formation. In an interview that was documented, or that was covered by Bob Kriebel, the Journal and Courier, who wrote the old Lafayette columns, he expressed considerable reservations, saying that the signing was forced upon the mayors of Lafayette and West Lafayette, and that he did not agree to the plight of minority races here in town. Also saying that there have never been serious racial issues in Lafayette, while acknowledging that there were housing problems for Blacks living in the Lincoln neighborhood. And finally, in that article, he ended by saying there was certainly nothing to stop them from moving out of that area.
Well,
Now, Blue's comments, you could say that he was ignorant. I don't know if it was necessarily ignorance or just perhaps being misinformed. Because when you think about it, knowing what we know about the Lincoln neighborhood, why so many of them were gathered there with Lincoln School, because they were tied to that school for so long, they really didn't have any other opportunities to move to other parts of the city because that was the only school that they could go to. And so because of that, I think Blue was just misinformed about the situation, just wasn't totally aware of what was being faced by Blacks in Lafayette. Not surprisingly, Blacks responded to Blue's comments. In a statement, they protested the idea that Lafayette did not need a Human Relations Commission, and that they looked forward to presenting their problems finally in front of an official government body. It was part of that response of the signing on behalf of the Human Relations Council, and you could easily say that the commission got off to a rough start, which did not bode well for it because it soon faced its first issue in the fall of 1968. And this is the boy and dog statue episode. This is the first real test for the Human Relations Commission. There were complaints that were directed at Mayor Blue, who then referred them to the commission to look at. Now, this particular statue was located at the Five Points Fire Station since 1912. It had been cast in 1834, and the original owner's daughter had donated it to the fire station for display. And it became like this tourist attraction. There's pictures from the early 1900s of people gathering around the statue and kind of marveling at it, I guess. The person who donated it to the fire station, she said that a lot of people viewed it as the All-American boy. Lillard, on the other hand, said that it represented slavery and oppression. So as the Human Relations Commission discussed this issue and what to do with the statue, they came up with different solutions to the problem. One of them was leave it as it was. Another was place a white boy next to it to symbolize racial harmony. Another option was to paint it white. And another one was to move it to a museum and finally just replace it with a modern statue entirely. Ultimately, the commission decided they were going to add a white statue next to it to symbolize racial harmony. So they did that in December of 1968. But before they could do that, in February of 1969, the statue was beheaded by vandals. Now, what's interesting about when the statue was beheaded, no one knew who did it, but the Purdue Exponent and WASK were able to get a hold of the person who beheaded it, and they were able to interview him, which then made Lafayette police mad because the Exponent and WASK would not reveal who the person was. So, and you can't find it. It's in a 1969 issue of the Purdue Exponent. I looked it up, I had to read it. So after the statue was beheaded, Blue met with different representatives, including Lillard, to seek advice on what they should ultimately do with this, because at this point, this statue was a problem. It just, something had to be done. Lillard once again reiterated his stance that it was a reminder of slave status here in Lafayette. So ultimately, Blue recommended that the statue be sent to a museum. I believe he recommended that it would go to the Lafayette Art Museum, but then the Lafayette Art Museum said, no, we did not agree to this. We don't want it. So at some point between 1969 and 1977, the statue was refurbished and then it was placed inside of the Five Points Fire Station building. So the dog remained outside, but the boy statue remained inside. And then it just disappeared. I've not been able to figure out what happened. The last time I saw a mention of it was in 1980. It was Bob.
Where that's on Philly. We've had this conversation with MP.
It was mentioned by Bob Kriebel as like no one knows where it went. We don't know what happened to it. So the statue disappeared, but it certainly did not leave things on a good footing for the Human Relations Commission. So going into 1969, Lillard began publishing The Informer, his newspaper. First issue was published on August 31st, 1969. And before I forget, I want to make sure I thank Tippecanoe County Public Library for letting me borrow these issues from them. So this is the very first issue. It was kind of a plain paper, nothing really, not a lot of imagery, just a lot of text, very text heavy. Issues cost about 25 cents, but they were also free for those who asked. In 1969, there were 13 official subscribers, including the Human Relations Commission, which took it on to get a better idea of what issues were being faced by Blacks. Lillard also said that an additional 150 to 200 copies were distributed. Now, I don't know if, because back then this would have been the Albert Wells Library that would have gotten these issues, not Tippecanoe County Public Library. And so I don't know if Wells Library was an official subscriber to the Informer, or maybe Lillard just dropped them off as he was delivering issues around the city. I just know that a lot of the issues that are in these volumes have Wells Library stamps on them. So somehow they were getting to the library. Issues were created at Lillard's home. He lived up here on Alabama Street, just up the hill. And then he took them over to St. Thomas Aquinas at Purdue and copied them on their copy machine over there. So he ran off, 200 pages worth of issues at a time. And it contained a mix of national and local Black news. He subscribed to Black newspapers in Chicago, Indianapolis, and Pittsburgh. So then he would take those articles and then put them into the Informer along with other Black news. So how did the Informer fit into the Black press in the 1960s? So by this point, the Black press was no longer just focused on the news of the day. It now was taking on more serious issues like urban decay, unemployment, and the feeling of hopelessness that a lot of Blacks felt at that time. Now, the Black press in general had three hallmarks to it. One was creating community, there was asserting racial pride, and then assaulting discrimination. So then the question becomes, how did the Informer fit into all of these hallmarks of the Black press? So the first one, in creating community, it sponsored different events, which were usually held at Sunnyside Middle School. The first was Black Journey, which was a presentation on the contributions of Blacks throughout history in the United States. Another was the Joseph Holmes dancers who were from Chicago. It was kind of similar. They taught a lot of like African dancing and culture. The proceeds from these different programs were to go to start a Black Information Center over in the Lincoln neighborhood. And in a Journal and Courier article on the Joseph Holmes dancers coming to Lafayette, Courier said Mr. Lillard is to be complimented for bringing these to Lafayette to educate its citizens. Another way of creating community was that it featured a lot of recipes, a lot of different cooking tips, a lot of different recipes. It also was soliciting donations to create a community cookbook. Unfortunately, that cookbook is not in the volumes that TCPL has. I was really hoping to find that cookbook, but unfortunately, they're just not in here. Also included financial aid information. There is an article in a 1969 issue from a financial aid advisor at Indiana University who was giving information on how to find financial aid for attending IU that year. There's also information on the Burton Daycare, which was located at Second Baptist Church. This was named after Dennis Burton, who was the first Lafayette citizen killed in the Vietnam War, who was also a Black citizen too. And then it also featured advertisements for Al's Barbecue, which was located at 17th and Hartford Streets. Now, Al's was another linchpin of the community over in that part of town. It was opened in 1956 by Albert Johnson Sr., and then Albert Johnson Jr., his son, took it over. Johnson Jr., when he was interviewed in a Journal and Courier article, I think was in the 90s, he recalled a segregated swimming pools here in Lafayette and also having to sit in a segregated balcony at the Luna Theater in downtown. Now, over the years, Al's became an unofficial meeting place for civil rights discussions, particularly in the 1960s. Johnson himself said, in the 50s, you came for food. In the 60s, you came for political discussions. In the 70s, you came for blues music. In addition, it also hosted Miss Black Lafayette pageants. And it also closed in the 80s as part of that expansion of St. E. So another hallmark of the Black press is asserting racial pride. And within each issue of the Informer, Lillard wrote different editorials on different issues facing Blacks. One of them was I See Blackness, which appeared in one of the very first issues of the Informer. find my notes. In that editorial, Lillard wrote that he saw Blackness as being wholesome and liberating. In addition, he also wrote, he and other contributors, who I'm guessing were like family members, they wrote articles on various aspects of Black heritage. So it could have been like famous Blacks in history, like George Washington Carver, or the earliest known Black cowboy, things like that. And then also a lengthy write-up on the history of Second Baptist Church in a 1970 issue. And in that particular article, they wrote, this is our heritage. Second Baptist is ours, and it is our responsibility to keep that going for future community members. One other way was through assaulting discrimination. So again, this comes from Lillard's editorials in the Informer. So in Let's Stop Whistling Dixie, he wrote, quote, "Why should Black students have to go to class under the banner of slavery?" It was a discussion about Confederate flags in schools being held with the American flag. Another one, Blacks are learning street politics. In this one, he advocated using the ballot box to bring change and not extremism like the Black Panthers. So he stood in the opposite of that. And finally, in Removing Barriers, he wrote about breaking doors that were not yet open for future generations to then use those opportunities. In other editorials, a lot of times he would write about the lack of employment opportunities for Blacks and groups speaking to Black needs, especially once the community center closed. And then also another way was response to KKK flyers that were found here in Lafayette in 1970.
Yeah.
So
I remember the flyers coming through my neighborhood. I only lived 2 blocks away from our barbecue and grill. The reaction of the Black males at that time were, when the flyers came through, people started very quietly arming themselves because we were expecting trouble, but it never formed. The word had gotten out that the Black community was ready for any trouble, and we were threatened that they were going to actually show up. But for some reason, they never appeared.
So these flyers appeared in June 1970, and according to different people interviewed by the Journal and Courier in response to them, these may have come from the Mooresville area. Now, naturally, the Human Rights Commission stated that they deplored the flyers, and Mayor Blue said, "We don't condone this." What is missing, unfortunately, is that the issue that would have covered these flyers in the Informer has not been saved. So we do miss that part of it. But with that said, someone wrote a letter to the editor in the Journal and Courier not long after this, and in that letter, they wrote praising the Informer for Lillard's efforts to educate the white community in Lafayette and its response to the KKK flyers. So we get an idea of what was said in that Informer issue, but unfortunately, we just don't have that issue with us to really get the full response from Lillard. Now, the last known issue of the Informer appeared in September of 1972. This just means this is the last issue that appears in the holdings of TCPL. It may have continued a little longer. I don't know, but we know for sure. We just know that the last issue was in September of 1972. Lillard recalled many years later that it just got to the point where he could no longer do it by himself. It just, he'd been going at it for three years now. It was just very hard to keep that going by himself, just keeping up that routine. But even though he stopped with the Informer, that did not mean that he stopped remaining involved in local civil rights discussions here in Lafayette. So as the 1970s progressed, Blacks felt that there were no opportunities for them to succeed because a lot of them noticed that there were no Blacks like in professional positions like doctors or lawyers, and so they just felt that there was really no chance for them to aspire to those kinds of positions. Lincoln Community Center moved out of the neighborhood in 1966 and moved somewhere down onto Union Street. So it moved about 7 or 8 blocks away from Lincoln School. So it was not in the neighborhood anymore. And so there was just no place to go for a social outlet anymore. And as the 1980s came around, St. Elizabeth Hospital started to expand. And because of that, Second Baptist Church closed and moved, and then its building was torn down. Al's Barbecue was torn down. And so a lot of that cohesiveness of the neighborhood was lost. And a lot of residents who lived in that neighborhood at that time, they lament what happened in the 1980s because whatever was still there was just gone completely and it wasn't going to come back.
Well, the house that Al's Barbecue and Grill lives, his house is still there that he lived in. It's still sitting there as some kind of a regional office for the hospital. His home that he actually lived in is right on the corner by itself with a big parking lot around it.
On the corner of where?
Oh, Okay, the same street that the church was on, and then it comes up
Okay.
and it hits into a 17th Street.
Oh,
And it's just right there on the edge, sitting by itself. The bar, of course, is long gone.
yeah. That's interesting. I did not know that. I didn't know he lived that close to the restaurant.
If I was about 8 houses away from him.
So also in the 1970s, Lillard started to criticize the Human Rights Commission as not being transparent enough in its proceedings. And he started to, in one article in the Journal and Courier, he said that if people just listen with a more sympathetic ear, we'd be able to solve our problems a lot easier. And it was also in that article that he gave what I think is my personal favorite quote, saying, "I found that cussing, slamming, and damning didn't get anything done. You have to attack the system from within the system, along with a lot of cussing, slamming, and damning." So Lillard retired from Purdue in 1985. By that point, he was a clerk in the chemistry department. And then through the 1980s and 90s, he started to share his experiences either in articles in the Journal and Courier. I believe he also did some programs for the Historical Association in the 80s. And then unfortunately, he passed away in April of 1994. So he really wasn't that old. He's only about 72 when he died. So he was kind of a young age, really. So with the Informer, we discovered first off that the Informer belongs to the larger Black press of Indiana. Even though it didn't last for very long, it still had those same hallmarks that other newspapers like the Indianapolis Reporter had, where it would assault discrimination, assert racial pride, and build community. It also gives us a lot of insight into Lafayette's Black community in the 1960s and 70s, especially after the closure of Lincoln School. Because once the school closed, I sort of view the Informer as being Lillard's attempt to fill that gap as a community resource to provide information on different topics that were relevant to the Black community. And because of that, we discovered that Lillard was heavily involved not only in civil rights matters like in the city, but also just by creating the Informer to just provide that resource to different residents in the aftermath of the closure of Lincoln School and the community center. That concludes my presentation.
Yeah. You said that he copied them at St. Tom's. What kind of copy machines were there in 1969?
I don't know like what kind of machine he used exactly, but if you look through different issues, you can see like where he would like copy the newspaper clipping onto the piece of paper. So, because it'd be like the articles with all these different, typesets and fonts. So you can see like they actually came from different newspapers. He would just cut them out and then copy them onto a sheet of paper.
But it wasn't the purple, that mimeograph.
The mimeograph is what I'm thinking of.
It might have been
It
mimeograph.
might have been mimeograph.
It might have been. I don't know for sure exactly what.
They didn't have the kind of copies that.
No, it wouldn't have been, it would not be like a modern copy machine.
And it wasn't like typeset like a newspaper.
No, it was not. It was just
Probably a mimeograph.
8.5 by 11 sheets of paper with a lot of
Are
text.
those originals? Those are,
Because those are black, at least they're not purple, right?
those are.
Oh, yeah,
original
these are the originals.
Informers?
Yeah, these are the originals, yes. And there were some later on that had color to them.
And those are in the Indiana room at the Tippecanoe County?
Yes.
There we go.
So as the Informer went on, the front pages became more decorative, a lot more colorful, a lot more images. It even started to have like its own logo too, that was on the front page.
Yeah.
So as it went along, the production kind of got better with like the imagery, the colors and things like that. But with that said, by the end, I think you can tell Lillard was starting to get tired because they were just starting to become a little more sparse in their content. So they just didn't have as much as they did when they first started in 1969. Yeah.
I gather that there's several issues missing, so it just got me thinking during your talk. I mean, it's so interesting to hear about this. What have you tried to do to find issues elsewhere? Just was thinking, would St. Tom's have kept any of them?
No idea where any other.
Put out the
Purdue
word.
Archives has some issues too.
Do they really? I did not know
The
that.
library, I think they moved them to the archives, so I'm not sure now.
I did not know that.
That'd be cool to put it together. This is a very interesting story. Thank you.
We have a question from online, is if any parts of the Informer have been digitized?
No, No, but that would make a good project, though.
Do we know why St. Tom's? I mean, that seems like a schlep from Lafayette.
I'm guessing he probably did since he worked at Purdue,
Okay.
so he probably would have just like went over there when he was at work or when he got off of work and then copied them there. Cause he ended up working at Purdue for, I want to say close to 20 years. So I think that's probably how he got over to St. Tom's. Because yes, it does seem kind of random, given that he lived over here, to go all the way over to St. Tom's.
Doesn't seem that random, because St. Thomas would have people there who would be more than non-judgmental and more supportive and
Also true.
Sorry, St. Tom's would have people who are what?
more non-judgmental,
Non-judgmental.
more worldly experience, traveled.
And I would not think that like Second Baptist or AME would have had the resources for that. So it probably would have been easy. So yeah, it probably would have made more sense than to go to St. Tom's in that situation.
Yeah, Second Baptist Church, that would be their approach, kind of, it didn't have a lot of resources for that. So St. Tom's, yeah.
Yeah.
You talked a bit about Lafayette's Black community and how the Lincoln School was really pivotal to that. And that got me thinking about the Black Cultural Center and how that was sort of the hub for West Lafayette, the campus Black community. Was there a lot of interaction between the two communities?
Not that I know of. Lillard, like in the Informer, he doesn't really talk a lot about West Lafayette. Like the only time I know of is that the West Lafayette Human Relations Commission made a decision that Lillard was in favor of, and he wrote very favorably about that, saying like, "Oh, you actually did something right on West Lafayette." So, but other than that, no, I don't know of very many interactions like that.
Okay. I was thinking, I thought I remembered there was the dorm that was dedicated to the two sisters. And I remember there was something about the Lincoln School where they had to be housed there. Or there was some sort of connection with Black students at Purdue.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking if there was some like spatial connection.
Yeah, right, would have their hair done.
Yeah.
It's actually, I mean, this has just opened my eyes to more, I knew nothing about this history. I mean, I think many of us were probably shocked to learn from, I learned from the most recent book about Purdue, that it was a sundown town, that all the students had to live over here. And so how this community, you know, was strong and things. So I guess I just wanted to ask more generally, if anybody, has somebody written sort of the history of Black people in Lafayette? Or generally, this is very interesting, specific. Or is that part
I
of
mean,
the
if you
book
want-
that you look
I mean, if you want to learn about like the baseball side of it, I did a presentation here last year on Black baseball in Lafayette.
that would be central to my.
That might be a good start.
So there was a college professor who did like the GIS project with some of her students where they were spatially mapping Lafayette's Black history and some of that like based on records they have. And so I think I found it through Dave Banger, I think, and you can go there and it shows different like salons and locations and restaurants. And it'll give little like historical details of some of those sites on the map. So it's kind of cool to see it like spatially mapped out.
I guess one thing about the Black community in Lafayette, at that time, I grew up in that area. Before we were able to spread out among the general population, the Black community pretty much right there around Shawnee Hospital. There was no branching out living here, and everybody lived in that community. And when Shawnee started to expand and buy up houses and stuff, and first the church went, then the houses went one by one, and I was, my dad's house was close enough that when it got sold, that was it. The Black community finally, some of us were glad to be able to spread out and go somewhere else, even though we were kind of forced to when the property got sold. You had to go somewhere else, but we still kind of missed having a Black community. And I was a member of the Black Cultural Center at that time. The connection we had with the community was pretty much with Purdue, was trying to orient with white students. We were trying to teach them more about our history and why that we were interlinked. And something else people tend to forget, even with all the stuff that was going on in Lafayette at that time, generally white people and Black people in Lafayette generally got along fairly well. And a lot of people feel that, and that surprised me when I look at it. I never had, and my dad never had any conflict, except maybe one time, I can't remember
Right.
one, but generally people got along fairly well. Fowler was a bigger problem than Lafayette. Because Fowler was one of the headquarters for the KKK in Indiana.
Oh.
Yeah, and that's where my grandmother and my mom came out of Fowler. If you were white and lived in the Fowler area, it more assumed you would be a supporter of the Klan. If you were white, but my grandmother told me story about going into the local grocery store that was run by white people, and their reaction was, "Oh, Miss Peterson, glad to see you. What do you have today?" So you just never know.
Yeah.
There's so much history there that most of us don't know. I certainly haven't. That's not Tippecanoe County, right? Fowler is probably.
That's been.
Lynn County, okay, but that should be written for these things. to learn. Why did Lincoln School close in 51? Was it desegregation? That's a
Yeah,
lot.
Indiana passed the desegregation law in 1949. And so it took about,
That's the Supreme Court.
it took about 2 years to finally transition out of Lincoln School. But 51 was the last school year at Lincoln.
Yeah, a related question from online is, do you know of any archive or resources about Lincoln School?
I would assume the Historical Association would be the better one for that.
Sterling McElwain kept them and they're at TCJ now.
What kind of documents?
The school ledger books, student registers, his own records as principal.
Did they have a yearbook or something that would be a little more
I've never
general?
seen a yearbook.
Like articles or?
They have pictures
Okay.
and they have articles. Martin Lamberson, the resident at the Indiana Veterans Home, went to that school. And his aunt, Miss Winthrop, was a teacher there. So Martin Lamberson in Indiana Veterans Home would be a great resource. He's got lots and lots of original photographs of that school.
Oh, we've identified a lot of good projects here. We just need to be able to do them.
That I taught for the next 10 years.
Anything else?
What would it take to do that? That they're bound now.
They are bound.
So it would-
You could do them bound. Might be a little, I don't know how well they would turn out since they're bound. We don't want to just bind them for that matter either. But there are scanners that you can use where they have a V shape that you can set the book in and then scan it that way. But as I say at Wabash, digitizing, just scanning is the first step. It's a whole other process to do all the metadata for all the different images. So digitization takes a lot longer than you might think it does.
For your presentation, I wish I had a copy of it, because people, I like to show all this too.
Well, that's gonna be on the GCHA website, it's the recorded Zoom meeting, and yeah.
We're gonna send in about a week or so, it'll be on the website.
And that's where you can find,
Because I'm a whole guy, I don't do that.
You can come into the GCHA on the times we're open and somebody will show it to you.
and you can also find my program from last year on Black Baseball on their YouTube page too.
Yeah, about a week.
But this isn't among your 13 articles for the book.
No, it is.
This is, okay.
Actually, the informer was not on the list. But when I started looking at it, because I was writing those articles at TCPL, I discovered that we had this, so I asked if I could write an article on it. So we were able to get an article in the book on it.
Hi, I had a question. I'm here on Zoom. I don't know if you guys can hear me.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for this presentation. It was very informative, and just enjoyable to learn about this history. I actually moved here to this area from Georgia and was, of course, very familiar with the civil rights and Black history there in Atlanta and across the state. But once I moved to Indiana, that was really one of the first things that I looked for is where are where are the Black people? Where is Black history here in this area? And so it's just been really nice to connect to that history. But one question I had specifically for the presenter is about the way you talked about Mayor Blue. You specifically used the term misinformed about like the plight of Black people in the area, and in comparison to kind of how you framed the Black Panthers as like radical or extremists. And so I'm curious, like how you came to understand or know that the mayor was misinformed about, the happenings of Black people in the community. Like, just kind of, if you could just talk a little bit about that, I would really appreciate that.
I think a lot of that came because I didn't discover Mayor Blue's comments until almost the very end of putting this together. So actually, I just discovered them like a couple weeks ago. And at that point, I had had a much deeper understanding of Lincoln School, what it meant, why residents were sort of limited to just living in that one neighborhood. And so I think just based upon what I already knew about Lincoln School, I then took Blue's comments and kind of compared them to the existing circumstances at the time and came to that conclusion that they were probably just, he was misinformed, just didn't fully understand what living in that community was like.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for that response.
There are other questions, thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank
very
you.
good.
Very good presentation.
And if you want to look at these, you can. I just have to get them back to the library before they close.
Oh, were they close tonight? You got to
Yeah.
look for hours, not
Yeah.
days, okay.
Because technically those are non-circulating, so.
National.
Sir.